Joined by Mike O'Donnell. He's one of three Republican candidates for Secretary of State, appears on the primary ballot along with Mesa County Clerk Tina Peters and former Jefferson Clerk Pam Anderson. Anderson joined us earlier this week on Next, and Peters has not responded to our interview requests. Mike O'Donnell, thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity and the invitation.
You are running for the job to oversee Colorado's elections. You're facing off against someone described, I think, fairly as Colorado's most visible election denier, Tina Peters, and Pam Anderson, who says that there's no evidence of election rigging or widespread voter fraud in the 2020 presidential election. Do you believe that either widespread voter fraud or election rigging played a decisive role in the 2020 presidential election?
That's a good question. I'm probably not in a position to opine on that because I haven't checked into it. What I'm doing, and just to back up a little bit, the role of the Secretary of State has actually two functions in the state of Colorado. One is to oversee commerce in the state, and then, of course, oversee election integrity. The way I'm trying to understand how election integrity works is really look at the voter roll. So I've purchased a copy, like anyone can, of the voter roll here in Colorado, and I've been working my way through that on my spreadsheet. I am finding things that seem peculiar to me, and I would like the opportunity to explore them further. For example, 9 people who claim that they live in a UPS store. So I'm seeing lots of extra people living in houses. So it's obvious to me that we do not do a very good job of removing people from the roll once they leave the state. And so from the perspective of, do we have a clean voter roll? I think we do not. And so how that is then being used is another question. But again, I don't have access to the 2020 voter roll. I see, because of policies like our automatic voter registration, we're adding voters at 2, 3, 4 times the rate that our population is changing. So I know that there's a lot of activity on the voter roll. So again, I'm not going to wade in on the 2020 election because there's really nothing we can do about that. But we hopefully can get a clean voter roll, which will mean that as we move forward, we have more certainty around the fact that people who live in the state and hopefully people who are citizens of the United States are the ones that are allowed to vote in our elections.
It's interesting that you focus so much attention on the voter roll and to what extent it should be cleaned up, because you've also prominently featured the fact that the Conservative Heritage Foundation has ranked Colorado rather low when it comes to how we run our elections. But one of the things that conservative group Heritage gives Colorado high marks for is for our voting rolls. I think they give us a 26 out of 30 on that. You think they're wrong in that assessment?
Well, based on me going through the voter roll, I am finding again, I'm just looking at I'm going through, it's a big voter roll. We have a lot of people on there, and the way I sorted on my spreadsheet to try and identify who's attached to an address means that I have to cut and paste from 9 different spreadsheets to pull it all together. But I'm just looking at a property in Adams County, which has 10 active voters, and it's a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house. We've got 3 different groups of last names there, plus a couple of random people. And just from an outside observer's perspective, I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong, and it could potentially be that there are 10 adults living in this house. But it appears to me that we've got some people who perhaps lived there who've moved out. And there are perhaps new people who've moved in, whether it's a rental or an ownership house. But it's just really, and it's not impossible for 8 adults to live in a 2-bedroom house, but 10 adults to live in a 2-bedroom house, but it just seems unusual. And so I think it's a matter of being able to look at the rolls to clean them. I don't think they're as clean as perhaps someone says. I know I've seen that Heritage report. I don't feature it prominently, but I did put it on my website. And someone actually pointed out to me the other day that they don't think it's a very good report at all. So they've asked me to take it down. But irrespective, just my observation as someone who's actually looking through the roll, taking the time to page through the endless spreadsheets and find things, I'm just finding some things that just don't seem to be 100% accurate. And technology isn't perfect. Voter rolls aren't perfect. The mail system isn't perfect. So we just need to be vigilant and make sure that we try and keep our rolls as clean as we possibly can.
In your extensive search through Colorado's voter rolls, have you found anything that you have been able to link to voter fraud, which is, of course, a very different matter than who appears on the voter rolls?
Correct. There's only one. And again, I've been trying to look at what I call the low-hanging fruit. So where there are 8 or 10 people with one residence is usually what I'm looking at because they're fairly easy to see. But there was someone who pointed out to me that someone who actually used to be on my board at Colorado Lending Source, which I ran for 20-odd years or so, asked me when he found out that I was running for this candidacy, why he, who moved to Nebraska more than 5 years ago, still keeps getting ballots. And when I looked him up on the voter roll, I could see the house that he lived in that was sold. I could look at the assessor's office and see that the people who bought his house were correctly allocated on the voter roll. But then I looked up his name to find out where it went, and it was reallocated to an address that physically doesn't exist. And I checked with the assessor's office. They do not recognize the address as an existing address. I checked with the Google Maps and the street views and stuff, and it's a T intersection. There's just no room for this house that should be there. So I'm finding a thing that's very concerning. Now, whether that's fraud or whether that's just an error that someone put or some input. But again, I'm not a detective or an investigator, but it certainly looks very unusual. Someone is voting from this house. It's not him. And he just asked me why he keeps getting the ballots, which he just, like many people who get excess ballots, they shouldn't, but they often just toss them away. And so we really need to make sure that we educate people, or another thing, allow someone who does live in the house, who is getting ballots for people who don't live in the house, to be able to report that to the county clerk or the secretary of state, and then have something happen as a result of that. Because an awkward thing here in Colorado is that we have to have the people who've moved out of the house to tell the county clerk they've moved out of the house. And if they're long gone in a different state, they're never going to do that. So it's we should allow someone else to be responsible and sort of report that. Excuse me, waffling on there.
So the current way that Colorado's elections work is that active voters get mailed a ballot. You can fill that out at your convenience. You can mail it in ahead of time. You can drop it off in person. If you choose to go and vote in person, you can do that early or on election day. What changes to that system would you advocate as Secretary of State?
Well, the way you become inactive on the voter roll, which means that you won't get a ballot automatically the next election, really seems to be that your ballot is returned undeliverable or is returned mail. Now, that in concept is fine, but we as a state mail out almost 17,000 ballots overseas each election cycle, and more than 43 ballots out of state each election cycle. When you mail a ballot overseas, it's unlikely to be returned undeliverable. And many of the addresses that I've checked, again, originally coming from Australia, we send more ballots, of course, to Canada, a lot to UK, and then Australia is the third largest country and recipient of ballots, including mainland China. We even send ballots to mainland China. But those ballots that go to Australia are unlikely to be returned undeliverable because they're expensive to come back and the post office isn't going to do anything. So we're automatically sending ballots to places where we won't know if they'll be returned. So these people who have put on their voter rolls a temporary address, which doesn't have an expiration date, will continue to receive those ballots at that overseas location until whenever. So, and I think there's a little bit of that back in the olden days, going back a decade or so. If you didn't vote at a federal election, you became inactive. It's really easy to be active again. But in terms of the county clerks who bear the cost of mailing all these ballots out, it seems like an extra expense that, we could do a few little tweaks that would make that. From the perspective of changing the active voters, I don't think I'd change that, but I think there would be a reason to introduce absentee ballots for people who are traveling or out of state or out of country, so that we don't just continually to keep people on our rolls forever and just hope that someone eventually will return the ballot. So it just seems silly to me.
I'd like to ask you a couple of pretty straightforward yes or no questions about how you might change voting systems. Do you think that Colorado should continue to proactively mail ballots to every active registered voter?
Well, again, that's legislation, and that's the way the legislation works. I think there's definitely, it's going to take a while should anyone or the legislature want to change that, because people are used to that. I think we could tweak it, as I said, in terms of making absentee ballots important, so we don't mail ballots out of state or out of country. And perhaps, the military definitely should always receive the ballots, but there are just people who are on the voter roll. Like we have 177 countries we make ballots to, including 2 that claim to be in the Vatican, and neither of those addresses exist in the Vatican. So there doesn't seem to be any checks or balances or time limit on those things. But mailing out ballots, that's what the law says in Colorado, so that's what we'll continue to do.
And I'm asking you what you would advocate for if you were elected Colorado's lead elections official. Understand that these things need to go to the legislature. So again, the question is, do you think that Colorado should continue to mail ballots to every active registered voter, let's just say within the state of Colorado?
Mm-hmm. And I would be fine with that. Again, I think as long as we can get the voter roll cleaner than it is now, I think I'm perfectly fine with that. Again, and we've had, I think even your group has talked about the issues around people who might be here on a short-term basis getting added to the voter roll. And so those are things that we need as a state legislatively or through the law system to define when is a resident. And those are things. So residency is very fungible in this state depending on which agency you're talking to and whether it's a university or a DMV. So there are things that we need to clarify which may change how many ballots go out. But other than that, I think that there's, under the current scenario, that's the law, is we mail ballots out to active voters. And, perhaps we have a few more active ballots going out today than I think we should because the people aren't there. But other than that, I think that system works currently. So I've lost you. Sorry. We've lost our sound. I can't hear you at the moment.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now you're back.
All right. Sorry about that. We're back. Your two Republican primary opponents have vastly different assessments of the current Democratic Secretary of State, Jena Griswold. And I'm curious where you come down on this. One primary opponent of yours, Pam Anderson, says that she believes that the current Secretary of State, Secretary Griswold, is too partisan, but has not done anything illegal. Your other primary opponent, Tina Peters, suggested that Secretary Griswold has committed treason, which is an offense punishable by death. What is your assessment of Secretary Griswold?
Well, my assessment is not so much of the secretary. I don't talk about people or personalities, but the Secretary of State's office is a business office. And it really, as I said, has two functions. It's to enhance commerce and it's to ensure election integrity. I think that the office has become a little political. I don't think it needs to be, because helping businesses is fairly straightforward. We have more than 1 million business registrations every year in Colorado, in return for which we don't give anything back to the businesses. And then election integrity really starts with someone who's a resident and someone who's a citizen. There are some rules that have come through that seem to me a little more political, in the sense that, for example, Election Rule 2.4.1 directs the county clerks that if they get an application for someone to join the voter roll and they do not check the box that says, are you a US citizen, yes or no, the county clerks are directed to process them and add them to the voter roll. So we don't require any evidence or even certification that someone who's foreign born like me is a citizen. And that, to me, seems a little political. So again, the office is a business office and it shouldn't have any political aspects at all. It should be an unexciting office in the sense that we're really here to help the state ensure the elections are free and clear, and we're here to help businesses so that we can grow more jobs in our state. And to me, it doesn't seem like a complicated office, or it seems to have become a little more complicated than it needed to be.
You certainly are putting a stronger emphasis on the business functions of the office than we've heard from the last few elected secretaries of state. What specifically should that office be doing to assist small businesses that it's not doing now?
Well, it doesn't really do anything to help small businesses now. But if you look at it, the more than 1 million business filings that occur every year in Colorado pretty much pay for 90% of the day-to-day operations of the Secretary of State's office, even though they don't do very much to help businesses. We have about 850,000 businesses pay their $10 renewal fee each year. And we have about 150,000 new business formations every year in Colorado. But of that 150,000 new businesses, we only see about 15 to 16% of those businesses create jobs. And as a state like Colorado, where we haven't yet recovered our unemployment rate to pre-COVID, which many states have, we're lagging behind most states. To do that, the Secretary of State's office could be cooperative with the Department Office of Economic Development and International Trade. It could promote the Minority Business Office if the businesses are minority owned. It could not be a silo and just keep that information to itself, but it could also work with our Small Business Development Center network and the network we have around the state to really try and, for example, if we can increase the number of startup businesses, 150,000, from 16% of them creating jobs to 17% or 18% creating jobs, it could make a huge difference to our economy, because local jobs tend to be sticky during a downturn. And every time we as a nation try and rein in inflation, we end up with a recession of some way, shape or form. And when that happens, the bigger businesses will lay off people much more quickly than the smaller businesses. So it's important to ensure the diversity of the Colorado economy, to ensure that we have more local jobs. And so I think the Secretary of State is could be in a very critical role to play that role, to try and work with the legislature, work with the other departments to try and really introduce more activities that can promote small business in this state.
On the issue of election integrity, you said that that no one, Democrats in particular, is interested in true election integrity in the state of Colorado. There is currently a bipartisan election security bill that's working its way through the legislature. It's changed since it was introduced. It may change after we talk here. But do you support that bill as it currently stands before the legislature? It would deals with the physical security of voting systems, certification for people who run elections, that sort of thing.
Yes, I didn't say that the Democrats didn't believe in that. A lot of Democrats have reached out to me to support what I'm doing. I think the critical thing here is that the National Institute of Standards and Technologies creates standards and guidelines for election machines and stuff like that. And the standards we're still working on here in Colorado come from 2005. The 2021 standards, which was the first upgrade that NIST did for election systems and election security and penetration tests on machines and stuff, is something that isn't part of this bill. It ought to be part of this bill because a lot has changed since 2005 from technology. I don't even remember if you would remember what your operating system was back then. It was probably, it was almost DOS, but not quite. So now that we're in a world where we have smartphones, which are just small computers, the new standards that NIST has put out is something that addresses the issues of potential breaches that could come from those things. And I think as bare minimum, we as a state should be looking at making sure that our machines comply with the latest and greatest or even exceed the standards. So the bill you referenced doesn't seem to talk very much about looking at those standards or looking at ways we can continue to work with outside people to ensure that our machines are as up-to-date and secure as possible.
Michael Donnell, one of 3 Republican candidates for Secretary of State. We appreciate you joining us. Thank you for your time. Look forward to our next conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity again. Thank you. Take care.